Hello and welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Julie Doyle. The former Howard Government Minister Brough is one step closer to making a political comeback. At the weekend, he won LNP pre-selection for the seat of Fisher, which is currently held by the Speaker, Peter Slipper. Joining me today, we have Labor MP Rob Mitchell in Melbourne and Coalition MP Andrew Laming in Brisbane. But before we get started, let's go first to the man of the moment, Brough. Brough has previously confirmed he met with James Ashby, the man who's accused the Speaker of sexual harassment. Now, Brough says he's been upfront about this, but he still expects Labor to target him.
I had a call at 2:30 on Saturday afternoon from a journalist to say, and I quote, "The Labor Party muckrakers have been on the phone to say that they're going to do X, Y and Z to you if you're pre-selected." I don't know quite what the Labor Party's afraid of. I think if they stopped muckraking and started governing, it would be in everyone's interests. I have never misled the press one bit. I have always told the truth and the complete truth.
Rob Mitchell, to you first. Brough said there that he'd had a call from a journalist saying the Labor muckrakers were out to get him. Does Labor plan to attack him in this way?
Look, the pre-selection's for the LNP, but what I would say is I did have a bit of a giggle there about Brough saying he'd been up front. I mean, this is the guy who deliberately and knowingly went out to the press and said, "Oh no, I've had no meetings with James Ashby, never had anything to do with him," and then a week later coming out and says, "Oh well, yeah, actually I did 3 times." So it's really a question of judgment for Tony Abbott and the LNP. I mean, this is a man that Tony Abbott calls a close friend. It's a man who was opposed by Julie Bishop, Joe Hockey and others. So it's their call. But you know, Brough and the decisions he's made and his involvement with James Ashby in the Peter Slipper stuff will come out in the courts in time, but you know, he's tied firmly to Tony Abbott now.
Does Labor, though, Rob, plan to hone in on this, and as he says there about the Labor muckrakers being out to get him?
Well, it's funny that someone from the LNP would talk about muckraking. I mean, let's have a look at the nearly 60 suspension of standing orders in the Parliament that the muckraking from the Liberal Party through Christopher Pyne, through Tony Abbott, have done in wasting Parliament's time over the things like Peter Slipper situation. It's a bit rich for them to be talking about muckraking when we've got 2 years of it in this Parliament. We will target every LNP person, we will target every Liberal person, every National person across the country to show that they are not ready to govern this country and that Tony Abbott can't be trusted in looking after Australia's future.
Andrew Laming, to you on this one. Tony Abbott won't say at this stage whether Brough will be given a front bench position if the Coalition wins government. Do you think if the Coalition wins the next election he should go onto the front bench?
Well, Brough is a high flyer who performed exceptionally well in the Howard government. I'd expect him to do exactly the same thing in an incoming Abbott government. He's a man of enormous talent. He's got friends on both sides of politics, you need to remember. There's been plenty of public commentary over the last few weeks, but in the end it was 400 people, ordinary, everyday Sunshine Coast people who got together and elected him in a pre-selection. It's something you don't see in the Labor Party.
So you think it would be all right for him to move ahead of some of the others in the queue and go straight onto a cabinet position?
Well, it might surprise you, Julie, but it's all on talent. I can certainly say Brough is enormously talented, and particularly in my area of Indigenous affairs. This is a gentleman who travelled the length and breadth of Australia and made an impact nothing like many of his predecessors. And if you look at Jenny Macklin doing that role now, she's visionless, almost has no connection to Aboriginal Australia. We saw she was booed off at the NAIDOC dinner a couple of weeks ago, and all she does is run trial sites. At least Brough was someone who gave Australia the direction that we needed back in 2007, got the ball rolling. We haven't seen much follow-through from Jenny Macklin. I take Brough any day.
So what about his involvement, though, in the Peter Slipper affair? He has said that he's met with James Ashby. Do you think this has tarnished his reputation?
Well, clearly not a pre-selection, and in the eyes of everyday Australians, they're really more worried about how the Parliament is functioning, and they want this issue resolved. They're prepared to see it go through the courts and let the courts decide. So most Australians don't care about the toing and froing between political parties on this issue, nor the speculation, but certainly now that Mal has been pre-selected, he'll be working hard to win that seat.
We're not just talking about speculation, though. We're talking about court documents that show phone calls and emails and text messages. So you don't think that will have any influence on voters if this continues to come out in the way it has in the courts?
I'm pretty certain that it won't have any impact on voters, but you're right to say, is it a distraction? And the answer is it'll run through the courts. And actually, people are more worried about the 523 people who arrived on boats this week, the fact that it's more than double what arrived in the last 6 years of the Howard government. They're talking about the carbon tax. For Mal Brough, he's big enough to look after himself up in the seat of Fisher, and I'm sure he'll do well.
Rob Mitchell, we heard Tony Abbott say today that he thinks this will be a vicious campaign, and he was saying that compared to what happened in Queensland in the state campaign, that showed that voters didn't warm to that. So is there any concern that if Labor does go hard in this way, that it will alienate voters?
Well, we haven't said that we're going to go hard after in a negative campaign. I mean, if we want to talk about down in the gutter, let's look at the way Tony Abbott and the Liberal Party have dragged this parliament down. Tony Abbott is still having the big dummy spit. He's crying like a 2-year-old that he never got Prime Minister. And this stuff with Mal Brough and Tony Abbott and everyone else that's been involved in the Liberal Party, in the Slipper stuff, to try and bring down Peter Slipper, to try and bring down a government, divert democracy, is just a disgrace. And really, if we have, as I said, if we have a look at who's in the gutter and where it's in the gutter, it all points back to Tony Abbott as leader of the Liberal Party.
Well, let's move on now to another issue, and the opposition has indicated a coalition government could have the National Disability Insurance Scheme up and running by 2018 as recommended by the Productivity Commission. Let's hear from the opposition leader, Tony Abbott.
The Productivity Commission's timetable is deliverable with prudent and frugal government, but that's not what we've got now. The specific commitments that the coalition makes, well, they'll be given to people in good time before the next election.
Andrew Laming, to you firstly on this one. The opposition's finance spokesman Andrew Robb says this could be funded by a coalition government by cutting other programs, but you're already going to cut the carbon tax and the mining tax, so that's going to cost revenue. So where will the money come from?
Well, look, it's a question that an incoming Abbott government will have to consider. I mean, clearly, we see a Labor government that started with a massive surplus. They frittered that away in a blink of an eye. Now, when they actually are struggling to get the first surplus that they've ever delivered, they just run tiny, minuscule trial sites of this NDIS. The Productivity Commission was very clear about rolling this out, but we're seeing a government too timid to do that because they're tied politically to a surplus this financial year. These discussions about trial sites are something we're seeing with Jenny Macklin in Faxia as well, where a government that cannot lead, that's completely lost its way, is unable to even implement a policy because there's no money left.
But we're talking about when the scheme gets fully up and running, though. We're talking about the cost of how to keep it going once it's up and running fully. And Andrew Robb has signalled that programs would have to be cut or scaled back, and he says it's a matter of priorities. So what kind of things is he talking about there?
Well, you have to see the books as an incoming government to be able to understand exactly how dire the situation is, but coalition governments all around the country at state level are doing just that. So there will be tough decisions, but the coalition has a complete policy armamentarium ready for the next election, ready today, and you're right, some things we'll have to have tough decisions, but this is a government prepared to do it, in contrast to what we have at the moment, was a government that has never ever run a budget surplus, frittered away one that was provided by its predecessor, and now is completely lost on this NDIS, effectively faking it with minuscule trial sites, when in reality they've got no money to get this program started.
Rob Mitchell, just on this one, the Productivity Commission does recommend that the Australian government should finance the entire cost of the NDIS by directing payments from consolidated revenue. So why not adopt that?
Well, it's recommended that we'd fund the majority of it, and I just want to pick up Andrew's points there. Let's be very clear, it's a Labor government that has started the NDIS.
The part I just read out said finance the entire costs.
Well, it says that it should fund the majority of the cost when you read right through it, when you read through the PC report. Now, the PC report, let's remember, this is a Productivity Commission report that a potential Deputy Prime Minister in the Abbott government says is worthless. You've got Joe Hockey already at $50 billion hole in their costings. They can't fund this, they won't fund this, Tony Abbott won't commit to it. And here's a challenge for Andrew. If you reckon you've got all your policies out there, why don't you put them out there? Because every time a Liberal person is asked about their policies, they say, oh yes, we've got them ready, they're ready to go, but they never produce them. The only hold-up in this NDIS has been the stubbornness of the so-called Gang of Four, the Liberal premiers, and we've seen Premier Baillieu and Premier O'Farrell commit to doing this. But Campbell Newman has not committed to do it. In fact, he's done it in the same week. It's Cerebral Palsy Awareness Week. And what does Campbell Newman do to show his support for disability? He cuts a $6.50 bonus for cab drivers for helping people with disabilities. That's just how committed the LNP is to disability services.
Andrew, just on that then, Andrew,
on bring it 12 months early.
Andrew Lemming, on that one, do you think the fact that the Queensland Premier Campbell Newman is saying the government there doesn't have the money at this point to contribute to a trial, do you think that's left people in Queensland pretty disappointed about this, particularly people with disabilities and their carers?
Look, I think everyone, even those who aren't directly caring for Australians in need, want to see the NDIS coming together. But I think Campbell Newman is right to be absolutely honest about the books that he's inherited. He has done that. Now, of course, he reveals that he did propose the proposition of a levy. And if you think about it, here is a Prime Minister prepared to have a levy on a flood, but not contemplate a levy for disabled Australians. So one wonders really where the bar is set for Julia Gillard on the NDIS and how serious she is about getting it going.
Do you think, though, he looks pretty mean-spirited on this one? I mean, we've seen Victoria and New South Wales have a change of heart over the past few days.
Look, I think the quicker you can get your books back in order, the sooner you can start to contemplate issues like this. But at the moment, of course, Queensland is focused on far bigger things, an emerging state debt approaching $100 million as we're going. So Campbell Newman was elected to fix that. I'm certain he's going to do that. And in fact, someone who addresses the massive state debt that's spiralling out of control is a state that can even sooner contemplate things like the NDIS.
Rob Mitchell, would it remove some of the uncertainty if the Commonwealth Government did go with the idea of paying for the scheme rather than trying to get the states to contribute to the full cost of running it?
Well, this is something that all governments should be involved in, and anyone that's had anything to do with people with disabilities. I know myself through my wife's cousin who has a disability. I know the struggles that they face every day. All governments should be putting in. The Queensland government puts the lowest amount per capita out of anyone, and it's done at a time when Campbell Newman throws his hands up and says, oh, let's do a great big new tax. And you just heard Andrew then. I mean, Andrew fought against the flood levy to help the flood victims in Queensland and Victoria. They fought against that. They would fight against a big new tax. Campbell Newman comes out totally out of the blue, out of the way, sits around the dinner table and says, oh, why don't we think of this? And of course the Prime Minister was right. It's not a thing to do this in. We've got to have our fair share from all the governments. And let's just find out, how much did Campbell Newman put into the Greyhound track just recently? That's where his priority lays, not with helping families with disabilities.
Andrew, what's your response to that?
Oh, look, simply, I think Rob is right in the sense that all jurisdictions will have to agree to get something like this up and running. But I think Campbell Newman's clearly focused on the books he's inherited. And as I've said, government prepared to take tough decisions and get the budget back in order is a government that can contemplate something like the NDIS sooner.
He's spending 2 years' worth of NDIS contribution on a Greyhound track. Now, let's be serious. That's not talking about priorities. That's not talking about getting the books back in service unless he's going to put the Treasury costings on race 6, number 4.
Well, Rob, you've got a good point, and you can always, find areas where government spend money in areas that you don't support. But in the end, it's the Prime Minister that has to show the lead. It's the Prime Minister that has promised to deliver the NDIS. But I think Australians are disappointed that she's going to find excuses, which is blaming premiers, and she's going to continue to run minuscule trial sites, as I've pointed out, rather than contemplating the real thing.
And Andrew,
the truth is, she actually has no resources to do that.
That's where we'll have to leave it there. Andrew Lemming and Rob Mitchell in Melbourne, thank you both very much for joining me today.
Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Julie. Cheers, Rob.
And join us for Capitol Hill again at the same time tomorrow.